My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Gibson, and I think this is going to be a great episode. I'm joined by Broderick Chavez, who, if people are familiar with kind of like, they'll indirectly know him through Dr. Mike Israetel of Renaissance Periodization. But if you've listened at all to anything that Mike's put out, Dr. Mike, you'll hear him reference Broderick. And kind of funny how this happened. I remember listening to a lot of the work that Broderick has put out in terms of podcasts and just talks he's done, and kind of whatever's been available. Honestly, I've looked at it and given it a listen or a watch. And it was in June of last year at Raw Nationals. My buddy Tom and I were sitting in a coffee shop, I was probably doing some programming or sitting on my laptop, writing about something, and look who pops up. It's Broderick, and we kind of met for the first time. And I don't know how much you remember that interaction, but I thought that was kind of a really unique thing to happen, given that I kind of listened to you for years beforehand, and then somehow in a Las Vegas coffee shop you popped up.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to run my yapper. And two, the idea of bumping into me in public is far-fetched, with the big caveat of except at a coffee shop. And if I remember correctly, that was Vespa Coffee.
Oh, that's right.
Vespa. It's quite literally, I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember the name perfectly, but it's quite literally one of my favorite coffee shops in the United States, and
wow,
one that I always go to when I'm in Vegas. So the chances of seeing me there are higher than probably anywhere else.
No, that's I imagine if I were in the switched role, I would have the exact same answer, in that the probability greatly increases if I'm in a coffee shop. And then, if it's coffee shop X, Y, and Z, because I'm currently out in Berkeley, California. So PHILWL's coffee shops are popular. Pete's coffee shops are popular. If I'm in a PHILWL's, it's almost guaranteed you can find me there most times. Pete's, and then there are a few others I'll kind of float around to work at. But no, I definitely share that affinity for coffee. And I mean, there are so many different ways I think we can take this podcast, and just to kind of give a preview for the listeners. My understanding is that you're an expert in, I would say you're an expert, at least from my position, in muscle hypertrophy, or building muscle, developing muscular size. So I think that's something I wanted to dive into. And then, because of the bend of the show, which is toward the sport of weightlifting, it's going to be hypertrophy for weightlifting, or indirectly hypertrophy for weightlifting. I think the perfect place to start always is, how did you even become interested in lifting weights in the first place? What was your first experience kind of with barbells or with weights?
Well, I've told this story many a times, and I feel very weird, one, talking about me, and two, repeating the same story over and over. So I'll indulge you, but I just want you to know that I just generally, everything about that is odd to me. But the answer is comically directly related to the organized sport of weightlifting, actual Olympic, in this case, rather specifically Olympics weightlifting, insofar as I had a very odd childhood, not in any way relevant specifically to this conversation, but I had a very odd childhood in that I was raised by my grandparents, who were obviously, a generation or so older than my parents would have been. And then on top of that, they lived a very old world type of life. I was born in 1971, so my formative years were, essentially 70 through 80. And yet the household in which I lived almost a Depression era lifestyle. And because of that, the moral of that particular story is there was very little television in my life. When I say very little, I mean perhaps an hour a week, perhaps not even that much. So anyway, one specific Sunday, for reasons I can't remember, I was allowed to watch the television, and I did. Rather greedily, kind of almost, ignorant, not even know what the fuck was on there, is sort of thing. And I just turned it on, and this is, again, young people won't even have a vague understanding of this, but this was an era when there were 3 channels. That was it. It was NBC, CBS, ABC. Nothing else on television except maybe some UHF, which it was it was kind of like the AM equivalent of television. And anyway, moral of the story, the programming that just happened to come on was this show called The Wide World of Sports. It was basically a sports center, like an ESPN Sports Center type thing, way before that was a thing. It was just a montage of assorted sports from, recent times. And this case, it was an old rerun, so it wasn't even recent, but that's what it was, just sort of blurbs of sports. And the major thing they covered was the Olympic Games with Vasily Alexia, Ken Patera, and Serge Redding. And I had no idea what I was seeing. I was completely ignorant of weightlifting or weights of any kind of fitness for that matter. But it just really, really struck me. And I must tell you that I was 5 or 6 years old. And I literally jumped up, gathered all the adults in the house, ran them to the television. I'm like, explain, what the fuck am I seeing? What is this? And they, just kind of, placated me, patted me on my back. Oh, they're professional athletes. I was like, all right, hold, full stop. Professional. This is their job. And they're like, well, yeah, I guess roundabout. And, somebody chimed up with the smart, like, oh, well, in the Olympics, you don't get paid, but that's what they do. And I was like, all right, that's a job. All right. It's decided here and now that's my job. That's the job I aspire to. And everybody giggled and, kind of patted me on the head and went about their business. And to their horror, every single day for years, when can I lift weights? When can I start training for my job? When can I, I was just really, really, and the more they resisted me, the more I got dug in. And so to bring this all to a somewhat of a crescendo, Christmas Day, 1981, my grandmother gave me a gift certificate to a gym, a barbell gym down the street from where she lived, Reading, Pennsylvania. Gym called Competitors Gym. Turned out, and again, kind of comically dovetailing, it was a gym owned and operated by a proficient Olympic weightlifter. So anyway, Christmas Day, 1981, I pulled this gift certificate. I'm exactly 10 years old. I was 10 years and a month. I turned 10 on November 6th that same year. So I pulled this gift certificate out of my Christmas stocking, and I literally, not figuratively, literally go running down the street barefoot in the snow, waving this goddamn gift certificate.
Wow.
Knock on the door, not even realizing it's fucking Christmas. The businesses aren't open. Like, I'm an idiot. What do I know? Sure enough, as fate would have it, the guy and his training partners were literally in there squatting on Christmas Day. And I'm beating on the door, waving this gift certificate. And it was so baffling to them. They opened the door and let me in. And I'm waving this gift certificate. And they're like, we're not open for business. We're doing a friendly squat workout. And I was like, that's exactly what I want to do. And not even knowing what the fuck that was. And sure enough, they put me in a rotation and I did high bar squats the first day I ever walked into a gym. And then there's one little teeny bit of layer to this that kind of explains who and what I am today. So never been in a barbell gym before, never actually had a barbell on my back before. I had done, push-ups, dips, that kind of thing in the basement, sort of in preparation for my job interview. And that's literally how I framed it in my mind, as silly as it is. But anyway, I, knew enough to know the basic mechanics of the operation. So I step under the bar, I shoulder the bar, I step back, and I face where modern gyms would have a mirror. They had a poster of Ken Patera in the bottom position, front rack, bottom position of a front squat, on a stage somewhere, probably an exhibition, aviator sunglasses on, shitty grin on his face as he always had. And out of the corners of my eyes, I realized that this poster is tacked to the wall with 18 gauge cattle syringes.
Wow.
And so that was my introduction. Day one, set one, rep one was full on in the fucking deep end in an Olympic lifting gym for real. And that was the kind of, connotation you're looking at when you're squatting. So that kind of launched, who and what I am.
Express the passion that defines you. At Virus, we understand that when it comes to performance, the slightest edge can mean the difference between winning and losing. Each product is designed and tested with performance in mind. This principle inspired the technology that is infused into our apparel. Built with the intention to move with you and work for you, we create tools meant to help express the passion that defines you. The future of technology-driven apparel. Improve performance, prevent fatigue, recover faster, and go further. Virus is a proud sponsor of Josh Gibson and the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast. Use code PHILWL for 10% off at checkout. That's PHILWL, PHILWL for 10% off.
That's an incredible story. I think that's maybe one of the most unique things I probably have heard on the podcast, and I've heard a lot of really, really interesting, unique stuff. I think to kind of explore it in two ways. I'd like to kind of explore it from like a professional standpoint, and then from kind of like actually in this, in the sport, competing in weightlifting or bodybuilding or powerlifting. So from kind of that point on, what did your involvement with lifting look like? I guess as an athlete, was it something that you kind of pursued competitively and tried to make the most of from that standpoint?
Again, I feel really, really weird talking about myself and my accolades because it's really not how I define myself. It's really not how I even. I almost say I don't value it because that's foolish. But it's very much not what I would prefer people to measure me by. However, I did, as I said, start in this Olympic weightlifting gym. I rather quickly realized, and the people around me were, they were aggressive and they were all the things they were, but they were also intelligent and thoughtful and most importantly, honest. And they and I sort of simultaneously realized, like, you're incredibly motivated, you're incredibly interested in this, but you're incredibly poorly gifted for this particular genre. I am slow. I have small hands. There was no part of me that was particularly well equipped for weightlifting as the sport defines it. I was, even from day one, I was an excellent squatter, but I was slow. I was an excellent puller, but I have tiny hands, therefore poor grip. And speed was something I didn't have, and then when I did even exhibit a teeny bit of it, my poor grip became wildly obvious. So Olympic weightlifting kind of wasn't an avenue that I was going to have any success with. Because of that, I did start to migrate toward the world of bodybuilding. And I competed as a teen. I was a very successful teen bodybuilder. And then through my bodybuilding exploits, I actually started to rub shoulders with sort of directly through bodybuilding. Through bodybuilding, I wound up interacting with Tom Platz. Through interacting with Tom Platz, I wound up interacting with Dr. Fred Hatfield. And Dr. Fred Hatfield sort of solidified my realization that at least half of my gifts were intellectual and not physical. And also that powerlifting was an exceptionally good outlet for me. And so I don't want to say I left bodybuilding behind, but I sort of created this sort of fantasy world where I would be a powerlifting capable bodybuilder or a powerlifter with bodybuilding disposition, or I don't know exactly how I framed it at the time, but that was the avenue I went down. And the more I went down that rabbit hole, the more I realized powerlifting was where I really wanted to be, bodybuilding less so. And so my competitive career went down that pathway. And then powerlifting, actually, I kind of did a Fred Hatfield, not really realizing it, in that I got more and more specialized on just the squat because it was really where my gifts were, and it was also where my mindset was. I was a decent bencher. I benched 200 kilos in contest at 100 kilos. Interestingly, I kind of double body weight bench pressed everywhere from 132 to 220. So double body weight seemed to be kind of my upper limit on the contest bench. I did 500 in the gym, kind of shitty and bouncy, but I've done it. But in the squat, that was where I really seemed to excel, culminating just before a kind of a career-ending injury, culminating in an 805. I did 365 kilos at 100 kilo body weight.
Wow.
In contest with, quote, rabbit ears, legal equipment, a.k.a. squat shoes, a belt, and 2.5 meter knee wraps.
Wow, that's huge. So I guess then just transitioning slightly to, I would say like the coaching side of things, but kind of hearing you talk, like, I would say kind of like the intellectual side of training, which is like thinking about training theory, the process, the application, and all of the kind of underlying stuff umbrellaed by that. When did you find yourself drifting into that territory? Was it kind of like 1-on-1, you got into it, you got into the sport, you started training and competing, you also started thinking about programming, nutrition, and things that are supportive to performance?
Well, there's kind of two answers to that question, and I'll really briefly run you through them. Not that I'm trying to dodge you, but it's sort of the thing that you can converse on for fucking ever. So I'll be as succinct as I can. One, the people that I just absolute dumb luck, the people that I happened into this Olympic weightlifting gym was just very blue collar, rough and ready, very, but in the same breath, very, very honest, and also as intellectually driven as they personally were capable of. They were not wizards. They were aware of that, but they were very intellectually driven insofar as there was almost and maybe even, I almost said unspoken, but maybe even spoken mindset that every minute you spend on the weight room floor, you should spend with your nose in a book. That the secrets were more than just pick it up, put it down. The secrets were that it was an entire thing, that you needed to understand physiology, physics, biology, nutrition, pharmacology, psychology. There was an understanding, even if there was a lack of understanding of the topics, there was an understanding that those were topics. So I got a really, really good, not necessarily education, but I got a really good exposure to the reality of how big, broad, and kind of cosmic the potential education was. So that was a really good, foundation, if you will. And then that just so happened to really align with my psyche, which was very, very cerebral and also dogmatic. That is who I am. I define myself as a grinder. Nothing came easy to me, but with enough goddamn application, there's almost nothing that I can't accomplish if I grind hard enough. There were few things in my life I was willing to grind hard enough. It turns out this was one of them. Then the real big pivot came in university. Because I was a fairly successful athlete and already fairly successful in the kind of drug-driven side of athletics, when I arrived at university, I had a little bit of a special place. And then my professors were kind of simultaneously lazy and also very good judges of capability. One in particular. And he realized that, I was the real deal, that I had a base of knowledge and a level of motivation. And I kind of very prematurely got thrown into some research projects and things that just gave me extra access and extra kind of upward mobility. And And then the real pivot on my coaching per se was the fact that that position gave me what I later came to reference as a sort of Rosetta Stone position, in that I was a strength athlete. I could communicate both physically and verbally with athletes. I understood their mindset. I understood their brotastic douchebag language. I understood their wants and needs, but I could also turn to the other side of the room and communicate in a succinct scientific language with the people with the knowledge and the kind of gateway, material. And so I became this conduit of, I could talk to the professors, I could talk to the athletes, I could communicate, and then, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I also knew where fucking Mexico was and could get the drugs. So I had a very unique position.
Yeah, that does sound very unique, and it's interesting to hear how early on that kind of developed, and how it kind of took hold through, as you mentioned, university. When did you feel like, and I guess this is a question that kind of coaches kind of are interested to hear about, because it varies so much, given that with an Olympic sport, especially weightlifting, and I guess with powerlifting too, people get into coaching at kind of at varying time points. I mean, some people start, in their early 20s or maybe late teens, and then some people in their late 20s or in their 30s and 40s. Like, there's no reference point for when it's appropriate to start coaching the sport. When did you feel like becoming a coach to athletes or for athletes was actually like a viable profession that you're going to make a living on, and you could actually kind of like pivot all of your resources toward?
Honestly, you're going to hate that answer. You really are. And but again, I have no other mode than just honesty, because I just don't have the temperament or imagination to dance around. The reality is, that first day watching Wide World of Sports, seeing people lift weights, quote, for money, made me realize that was my job. That was my career. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea how that would manifest. But the honest truth is, at a deep fiber level, I decided at age whatever that was, 6. No game, no bullshit, for real, I did. The point when it really gelled into, actually receiving money for work done was university. And again, that was just sort of that position that I was in, sort of logistically, if nothing else. It was the logistical aspect. Both, access to the academics, and also, like I said, access to Mexico, and having to fucking stones to, bumble across the border, speak poor Spanish, and buy the things needed. So it gave me, like I said, a very special position, which started to give me the realization that this was, more than a recreational activity. And then the real moment when it became this full on, which, by the way, I don't like or want or appreciate, this full-on commercial thing that I have now, really took hold in 2013. I was December of 2013. I was in a crippling accident. I was told I'd probably not walk again. I certainly wouldn't walk without a limp. I certainly wouldn't lift weights. Life-changing, end of everything. Turns out the doctors were not fully correct on that. I'm more capable than I should be, but that's a story for a different day. But at that moment came with an awful lot of baggage. I spent 9 months in a wheelchair. It was a big deal. And during that period of time, I had to figure out, one, how to just spend my time and not lose my shit. And two, the bank account's getting lower and lower. So I had to start figuring out a way to generate income. And that led to the podcasting, and the podcasting led to some high level coaching, some high level is probably not the right word. What's the word I want? Sort of big name coaching, that sort of thing. I made myself available to people, and that sort of thing happened. And then ultimately the member site, which I have, which is mostly about drugs, but also about training. So that's where that came from. And honestly, that was never a goal, and still to this day sort of isn't a goal. It's just a a kind of almost an ugly necessity.
Hey, what's up, weightlifters? Danny here, founder of Onyx Weightlifting Co., a leather accessories company specializing in weightlifting gear. In our shop, we make gear that doesn't get in the way of your performance because we understand that hitting lifts requires your full attention. Our straps, wrist wraps, and belts are designed to be comfortable and reliable, so all you need to do is make lifts. Thanks for listening to our friend Josh's podcast. You can continue to support him by visiting our online shop at onyxstraps.com and using his code PHILWL. That's PHILWL at checkout. See you on the platform.
Yeah, and that's interesting, and I'm curious to kind of use this as an opportunity. You mentioned starting to work with big names, so obviously you have an expertise and understanding of kind of the underpinnings of sport performance that would draw people to you. Which areas of that do you feel, and maybe it's like the entirety of it, right? It's training from top to bottom, but which aspects of it do you feel like you have not better than average, but like what do you find yourself most interested in? The thing that you feel like you've specialized in, and really do most of your consulting on?
My overarching sort of ethos is that nothing is in isolation. Everything is dovetailed together somewhere. Even my education, my undergraduate degree is biology. I am a biologist. And one of the things that was so deeply impressed upon me in that pursuit of biology, that one professor I mentioned specifically, is that even things that are kind of not part of biology are at least facilitated by biology. For instance, psychology. Psychology is not part of biology, but without biology, there could be no psychology. So this reality that everything, not drug use, not training, not pharmacology, not psychology, none of that stuff is separate or separable, forces every time, not forces, but at least led me in a way of thinking. Every time I found a new interesting pathway in pharmacology, that came with, and that's going to mean this to training and that to nutrition and this to the emotional component and this to the adherence. And so to me, the whole thing sort of creeped along in every direction. And every time you turned over one rock in one place, 10 sort of vectors shot out of that led you down different rabbit holes to different rocks to turn over. So I don't see it as a thing I specialized on, unless you want to call sports performance a thing, rabbit ears a thing, then that's what I pursued. But I never sat down and like, I'm going to conquer nutrition. And I cracked a bunch of books and studied that. My knowledge of nutrition came as a requisite. Well, people fucking eat. I deal with people, so I got to do that. Then I realized, well, people that lift weights eat different, so I got to do that. And then people that take drugs eat different, so I got to do that. And that was sort of how all of that developed to me. Now, what I will say, I don't know if this is the right time in the conversation, but I'll say it now because it's in my mind right now. And that is, I have a member site. I have like 8 or 10 ebooks, all those things. I try very hard in the opening chapters or prefaces of all of those books and material to point out that at this point in my life, the material I'm presenting is absolutely, unequivocally targeted toward drug using athletes. I make that as apparent and clear as possible for a number of reasons. One, because it's true. Two, because I don't think most people make that distinction. They're marketing to natural athletes while they take drugs or while they're, that sort of thing. I want a clear and hard separation. That is what this is. An awful lot of what I say and do would probably be, and I say probably because I don't fucking talk to them, know them, or care about them, might not be appropriate for natural athletes. I'm aware of that, and I'm comfortable with that. And in a sort of internally smiling way, I'm very comfortable with that. So I do think that's relevant to say out loud.
Yeah, and I think that's relevant, and I think it's a great kind of place in the conversation to drop that, because we can kind of transition into peeling back the layers with the kind of pharmacology aspects, because not that I know a lot about it, but I think it's, as with most things, rightfully so. It's probably grossly misunderstood, and I think kind of this idea of like, well, you kind of hear these blanket statements, and I'll just use these as examples, but like everyone's on steroids, and it's not that that's like incorrect in that everyone's using some sort of performance enhancing drug, but it's like everyone's on steroids. Like that in and of itself doesn't really capture any nuance or kind of explain the situation correctly. So I'd like to kind of start peeling back the first layer of performance enhancing drugs, incorporating things that are banned substances. So looking, I don't know, maybe more directly at drugs that are typically used in, say, Olympic weightlifting, if you're comfortable talking about that, or we could even use powerlifting kind of as more of a reference. But what tend to be the most used performance enhancing drugs? And then we can kind of look at like why, the mechanisms. And I think that kind of takes us down this cool rabbit hole of,
Well, I can answer that for you, but I think the answer would be, I don't say disappointing, but it would be so unconnected to the root reality that it doesn't help. For instance, I can say, well, testosterone, growth hormone, and insulin are the most used, but that doesn't really do justice to anything. What I would say is a much better way to think about things is, instead of steroids, think performance enhancing drugs, which widely opens the pantheon of things.
Right.
And then I would say this very obvious and almost shamefully childlike reality: drugs do things. Again, that is an ethos in my business. My underlings hear me say that literally every day. Drugs do things. The reality is that's true. And then the coaches or athlete or whoever's creating said application needs to then weed through what does the athlete need, and then what drugs do that. It's right tool for the right job. It's not, just universally testosterone will make you a better athlete. No, testosterone will do what it does. Do you or do you not need that? And then when you start thinking that way, and then you start thinking periodization and different blocks or periods in the year, you start realizing that what you use when is associated with what you're doing then, or what you need. What aspects are you trying to tease out of physiology? If you're trying to generate work capacity, that's one group of tools. If you're trying to generate maximal force, that's a different group of tools. If you're trying to develop hypertrophy, that's an entirely different group of tools. So instead of this, what do athletes use? It's more of drugs do things. What are athletes trying to do?
Yeah, and I could see why that would make for a better question. It's kind of looking at the training process, how it's generally structured. People train for muscular size, and then they try to specialize that tissue into producing more force and specific movement patterns, and then tolerate more specific training. And you kind of see this like that sequential aspect of it requires certain improvements or enhancements. So it's like what drugs would tend to do that best. So
Correct.
Approaching it from that perspective, when we do talk about building muscle, and maybe something to explore is like across different sports, say bodybuilding, powerlifting, weightlifting, if we're looking at athletes who want to put on muscular size, who want to increase their ability, for bodybuilders, just to increase size, for weightlifters and powerlifters, it's increase the ability for that muscle to do work in a specific context. What are generally used drugs for that, or what would be generally used drugs? And is it kind of the same from sport to sport if we're looking at the same, like I don't know if mechanistic change would be the right way to say it, but like the same outcome?
Well, even there, I think that the subtlety is lost on the average, and even, dare I say, the above average, quote, lifter. In that, for instance, one of the things I point out in live presentations, I'll put a cross-section of a muscle cell on the screen, and there's this, outer rim, this, membrane of the cell, and then there's the internal, then there's the cytosol, and then there's these black dots, if you will. And I'm like, those black dots are the actual actin myosin cross-bridge filaments. That is the part that's actually doing the lifting. And if you look at that in terms of percentage of the overall picture you're looking at, it's a very nominal percentage. So the reality is, when you say muscular hypertrophy, what are you hypertrophying?
Right.
What is it? Just the size of the cell? Fucking salt water can do that, for fuck's sake. What are you talking about? What exactly? Get specific and tell me, what the fuck are you trying to develop? Is it, for instance, bodybuilding, and you put it under the blanket of sports, which I do not. And by the way, I'm very big on and very pro bodybuilding. I'm not being negative, but it's not a fucking sport. There's nothing sporting about it. There's no running, jumping, frolicking, catching. There's nothing sport-like. It's a fucking pageant. One that I have a high affinity for, I have a high appreciation for, I'm deeply invested in, but it's not a fucking sport. So at some point, you have to define to me, what the fuck is it you are trying to develop? Is it actin, myosin, cross bridges? Is it cellular volume? Is it the organelles that generate energy? Is it what specifically do you need to improve? And then I can specifically tell you nutritional, pharmacological, and training strategies that will do that. This just kind of general idea, like, make it bigger, like that's fucking childish, to the point that it makes me grind my teeth.
Yeah. Do you think people approach it from that standpoint? Like,
yes, 100%. Get on any fucking dumbass bodybuilding forum. Spend any time. I mean, I love them to death, but get on like the RP forum and you just hear the most inane, stupid, for anytime someone uses the word mass, I want to just piss on their feet. Like, you want mass, put rocks in your pocket.
Yeah. Okay. So, and that's kind of why I was keeping it a little more broad, but like more specifically, if we're thinking about like, and again, like I'm aware of just indirectly, some of the drugs that are used and kind of what they do. And then I kind of see, like, when I'm looking through, people who were popped and what they were popped for, like sometimes it's, especially on mine, it's really hard to make sense of it, especially if there's a variety of drugs with a variety of effects. But since we're talking about muscular size, specifically like increasing skeletal muscle or contractile tissue, adding sarcomeres, are there drugs, anyway, this is kind of a dumb question, but drugs that specifically add the contractile units or allow you to put on mass that would be supportive of developing contractile units?
Yes. And real quick, I'm going to jump back to what you just said, is that you have a hard time making sense of people that have been failed. I strongly recommend that. Actually, it's one of the things I recommend on my member site, is people that are interested in the concept of drugs and sports, get a little notebook and write down, sport, athlete, if that even is relevant. I say don't even, incriminate the person. Just write down sport, male, female, weight class, and what was found in doping testing. If you do that long enough, you do start to see some real patterns, if you think of it in the right context. So I do strongly recommend people do that. I think rather than just taking people's word for things, having some measure of actual self-collected statistics is super valuable. So then moving to the question you asked. Yes. For instance, things have changed a little bit in the nomenclature. I'm both old in mind and in reality. My education started, my university education started in 91. So, my everything is somewhat removed by at least a generation. But in my period of education, there was a distinction between testosterone and anabolic steroids. There was testosterone, which was the root androgen involved in human physiology. And then there were synthetic derivatives thereof, which were anabolic steroids. Nomenclated such because the intention was to exaggerate the anabolic properties, or at least isolate, if not exaggerate, and then diminish the androgenic aspects. So they were meant to be, at least originally, very distinctly different things. Now, in modern terms, we have this AAS mindset, which is anabolic androgenic steroids, which is basically just anything with the root structure of testosterone. Fair enough. I still cling to the older definition because to me it's relevant. And if you think of it in that relevance, if you sort of think of a family tree, if you will, testosterone being sort of at the top, it is the blanket. It encompasses all of the effects of all anabolic steroids. Very blanket, very gross, very generic. Now, it's meant to do that because its job is to add gross, generic male characteristics to an androgynous, 8 or 10-year-old boy and turn him into a 20-year-old man. So over the course of 10 years, this blanket approach gives you some muscle mass, some masculinity, some aggression, some. Now, the idea of anabolic steroids was to be more contractile muscle specific. So if you just take that fundamental train of thought, you can kind of see what does what. Testosterone is this very generic sort of blanket athletic thing. And then anabolic steroids get more specific in their targeting. So if you went to a drug like, say, turinabol or primobolan, it's okay if you don't know what they are. Just know that they're reasonably common drugs. They are much more targeted specifically to actin myosin cross bridges. Therefore, bundles, filaments, sarcomeres, etc., and less to cytoplasmic volumization, mitochondrial development, enzymatic pathways, etc. So it comes down to, again, where exactly do you need to intervene in this process? For instance, a developmental athlete that's well below the weight class in which they will ultimately compete tends to stick more toward testosterone and 19-nor derivatives because those drugs tend to be less specific, therefore generating more volume and the douchebag bodybuilding, introduction of size. They are more size driven. Then as they approach a weight class that they're going to spend some time in, their drug use tends to migrate toward DHT derivatives, which are more actin myosin specific, less everything else. Therefore, they can continue to make progress, but it's much more targeted, therefore less gross total body weight.
Yeah, and you talked about gross effects in with respect to the changes in the muscle.
Yeah.
You also talk about the androgenic effects, and
Yes.
as you become more specialized for just adding kind of like the contractile units, do you lose the androgenic like effects or changes as well?
Well, again, lose isn't really the right word. It's what you're prioritizing. It's not a matter of loss or gain. It's a matter of priority. If your priority is just gross infrastructure, then that's what you pursue. Then you're obviously not specializing on force production or skill acquisition or any of those things. So it's a matter of, again, pharmacology nutrition should support the block of training in which it's in. That's like saying, what's the correct calories for an athlete? Well, what are they doing? Are they fucking sitting at home in traction because they're injured, or are they training 40 hours a week? There is no answer. The answer is in context of who they are and what they're doing at the time.
And I don't know, again, like this is me just kind of thinking through this as we talk, with respect to Olympic weightlifting, when we're looking at drugs that would increase the size it would increase the amount of contractile units within a muscle. So athletes who are attempting to put on effective muscle mass or usable muscle mass that will support performance. Do you see trends? Because one thing that I notice is it could also vary from country to country, and I don't know if that's like sophistication, strategies, availability, but generally when people are popped, it's like, yeah, it kind of looks. So there was a guy in the US, Ian Wilson, who got popped, and he was as far as like everyone knows, he was clean for the longest time. Kind of at the tail end of his career, he decided to kind of make the transition to using performance enhancing drugs, and then got popped for like.
Well, let me, just out of curiosity, since you seem to know who this individual is, I do not. I don't keep abreast of things. Did his on-platform performance change significantly at any point?
Oh, so very significantly. Okay. I think his best snatch, I think, was like 173. His best clean and jerk was probably 210, 215. And then in training, he released some videos where he did 187 and 227. And he jerked, I think, like 240 kilos or 242, which is like huge, right? And for an American lifter to do that is unheard of.
Well, that's, that at least is one of the, the major kind of sort of obviation points. I hear stories like that. I was expecting this story to go that way, as, so-and-so was clean for their entire career, and then just there at the end, they, started using drugs, and you look at their performance, there's no change. And I'm like, well, that's horseshit. If they were on drugs at that performance, then that means all past performances that generated that result were also said, drug use. One of the things that I would point out there is what I said earlier. Drugs do stuff. If you don't see a change in performance, then you could assume there either never was or always has been drug use.
Oh, interesting.
You see my point. I mean, go back and look at the initiation of drug testing in Olympic weightlifting. If you look at the Olympics prior to testing and then you look at the Olympics during testing, there's no difference in the numbers posted. Therefore, that can only mean one of two logical realities. Either no one was ever taking drugs or the drug test never worked. That's right. The only two realities that can support that data set.
Yeah. And then I guess one of the questions I kind of had, maybe look at it a little more diffusely now, but I don't know if you've picked up on patterns from different countries. I know you're kind of trenched in the US.
Yes. Well, no, actually I'm not. I have less to do with American athletes than probably the rest of the world for a number of reasons. But yes, bodybuilding would actually be the most obvious example of this. I know your context is weightlifting, but I'll use bodybuilding, one, because it doesn't throw anyone specifically under the bus, and two, it is somewhat obvious, especially if you go back to the quote golden era, which I really hate that language. But if you look at the physiques of, for instance, regional athletes, even Southern California versus New York, if you looked at London versus Stockholm, if you looked at geographic and Australia, if you looked at these geographic differences, you saw very different physiques, both from a training methodology, because of some influential person in the area was promoting a certain variety of training. Southern California, you had, say, fucking Vince Gironda promoting a certain style of training. And then because there was that style of training, you needed certain interventions to survive that training. So the drug use became somewhat targeted to the training method. And therefore, you got a synergistic appearance that cropped up time and again. So even in modern context, if you look at, say, female physique athletes, which I find a very particularly fantastic area, for instance, in Brazil, there's a really, really strong culture of both female physique alteration and drug use. They're very comfortable with drug use. And the physiques have a very distinct look. And the reason for that largely is the specific availability of drugs there. The choice of drugs that said women are able to access and are comfortable with, familiar with, counseled on, etc., is somewhat niche. And therefore it generates somewhat niche appearances. And then those appearances apparently become prized, and it exaggerates. There's a reason why, for instance, German bodybuilders are notoriously bigger, rounder, somewhat less detailed than the rest of the world. It's because the popular drug, largely because it's the one manufactured fucking there, happens to be Anadrol, which brings that sort of appearance. So there's this very geographic attitude in terms of what's available, and then also what the influential coach or athlete or person steering the program, if you will, promotes. So it does get very niche in that regard. And then when you transition this conversation into Olympic context, where the fuckery of the IOC is involved, or WADA, whatever specific agency you want to throw under the bus, they're all fucking criminals. But when you move into that, then you also have the context of, and you need to be able to get that through the drug testing protocols. So it is regional. It is thematic, if you will, based on kind of who's operating the program. And that's actually one of the reasons why I have less to do with American athletes, is because there is no program. It's just a goddamn free-for-all. And everybody thinks they're clever, and everybody, just sort of whatever. And it's mostly just douchebaggery.
And I think this is kind of a comment, but also just an aside. Just hearing you talk about this and thinking through it a bit, would there be an alternate universe that would exist in which you got into medicine or
No.
chemistry? Oh, okay.
Well, my minor is in chemistry. I have actually worked very, very passingly in that field, so I can't say no on that. But certainly not medicine. I absolutely do not have the temperament, disposition, morals, ethics, and I'm super aware of that. I don't hold any illusions or delusions. It became very, very apparent to me very, very early that my interaction with organized academia had a specific runway and no more. I can't be more honest about that. I rub shoulders with, Dr. Mike Israetel and Lyle McDonald and, Dr. Mike Stone and all these people. Yes, I interact with them, but I do it at a pedigree deficiency, because I just couldn't possibly expose myself to, or them to me, to be fair.
And you talked about regional differences in bodybuilding, which I thought is fascinating and kind of makes sense, right? With the context of having a specific pharmacological agent and it has specific effects, therefore it's like a predictable effect if it's in high use.
Agreed.
With weightlifting, and this would be kind of an interesting case study to also look at that. The Bulgarians, had and continue to have a very specific training style where it's maximum efforts, 1 to 6 singles, snatch, clean and jerk, squat. It's like very low. I say low volume, but it's like relative to what it's like lower volume per session, higher session frequency, very high intensity. And then on the other side, you have more of a kind of like what I would call like a traditional kind of like Russian approach, which is high variability, high volumes, more kind of like more like traditionally periodized training.
Yes.
Both steeped heavily in drug use.
Yes.
Given that Russia has pretty much been like, was booted from the sport, and Bulgaria just, everyone knows what happened with them. But would you see different patterns of drug use based on the different training styles?
Yes, because again, the training methods I would almost said exclusively, but that's obviously not accurate, but largely focus on differing attributes. The Bulgarian system being very high load, high velocity, low total volume. You're very much talking about active myosin cross-bridge. You're talking about nervous system and the ability of muscles to contract hard and fast in very low volumes. So you have a very limited amount of that sort of center column global energy systems, muscular volume. It's really just contractile tissue. So you're talking about very, very rabbit ears, pure anabolics. You're talking about highly anabolic, relatively androgenic compounds. Whereas when you're talking about the total amount of work done in the classical Soviet system, the work the athletes to death, the winners will survive mindset, that's more of a survival concept, which is much more native to natural biology, which is testosterone is in nature, the survival hormone, if you will. So you definitely see more. And also, if you look at, for instance, equivalent weight classed athletes, you tend to see differing physiques in the Russian model than you see in the Bulgarian model. The Bulgarian model tends to make people much more specific and specialized looking, whereas you look at the Soviet athletes, they almost universally they're imposing. They're just more general from head to toe. It's because their training was more general, and then their drug use was more general to support the general training, which created a more general creature.
Were there, because weightlifting has obviously been around, I think it was first in the modern Olympic Games, I think in 1896, and then has kind of like been in and out until I think like the 1920s. Kind of continued to stay in. It was huge in the 70s with the clean and press, and then kind of transitioned. And I think,
and comically, if I could interject, one of the things I find really, really comical is that was also much like baseball, when baseball was most popular was when it was most obviously drug infused. It still is, but it was more obvious and overt. And keep in mind, you're talking about that 70-72 window. Ken Patera, the first American to put 500 pounds over his head, who said on television in public, the coming Olympics will really be a test of which country, the US or Russia, has the better steroids. That was said live, out loud, in person. I don't find it coincidental that drug use, relatively speaking, equals athletic excitement. I don't think that's a coincidence. And I think it's embarrassing that the organizers don't own up, at least to the reality of that, if not the application of that.
Yeah. Are you familiar with when drug testing was first implemented in kind of the...
Absolutely. I actually had a one-on-one conversation, a very in-depth conversation with Bob Goldman, who was largely responsible for that. Yes.
Wow. So what was, obviously, I think the innocent listeners would imagine that it's like, okay, we want a fair playing field. We want, we want to support the athletes in a way that's...
Absolutely. That is horseshit. They wanted control. They wanted political control. They wanted leverage over the athletes. The organizers of these groups are basically pimps, and the athletes are the prostitutes. They wanted control. They wanted the ability to hold people's careers in peril so that they weren't outmoded. I mean, it's comical, but look at the world today. Look, we now have OnlyFans, so people can just do
Right.
porn on on their own terms, and there's no longer that. It sort of democratized that thing. The organizers of sports were aware of that possibility way back when, and they just wanted political control. Again, I'm not being an ass, but look up the definition of a bureaucracy and look up the purpose of a bureaucracy. A purpose of a bureaucracy is to support itself, not the people that it's governing. It's to support itself. That's why the International Olympic Committee was created, to gain control and keep that control.
Yeah. Do you feel like that has been the case since? And I don't know when maybe you can interject, but I don't know when drug testing was first implemented in Olympic weightlifting. But do you think it's largely been kind of like for that same end since? Because you would imagine that like over
even
time,
more so.
Okay.
Wildly more so. Keep in mind if the history of doping in sports, which is a super comical word, the doping. It's super, super comical. I don't think most people even know where that word comes from. If I may, I just find this so entertaining. I'll blurt that out. The word doping actually comes from horse racing in America in the 1850s. Horse racing was such a popular thing that cheating became a very popular thing. And the cheating was actually exactly the opposite of what you might expect. It's very, very hard to, at the time, there really were no commercial sports performance agents. There was thoughts and kind of gimmicks, but there were no real agents to improve performance in horses. Amphetamines weren't yet a thing. Steroids weren't really yet a thing. But one of the things that was a thing was opioids. And so what would happen is a, quote, doctor would dope up a horse to make it incapable of running at its full capabilities, therefore handicapping a race by stealing advantage rather than gaining it. And if that doctor did their job poorly, the horse would look anesthetized, and the crowd would actually scream, "Doped." And that's where doping comes from in the lexicon of sports.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I now I'm going to think twice before I ever use that word. But as far as the kind of like governance of the IOC or WADA and implementing drug testing, you kind of mentioned that over time the agenda hasn't really changed. If anything, it's kind of worsened.
No, and there's also the reality of again, and this is a little hard to kind of talk about out loud, and not to be an ass, and certainly not to be superior, but with communicate this to people that have limited understanding of the science. Boy, I hate that phrasing, but the science of how doping tests are performed. You realize that the very design of the initial tests was almost not to catch drug users, but to sort of create boundaries or parameters and sort of define the margins of drug using. For instance, the TET ratio. 99% of the humans walking the earth have a 1-to-1 ratio. So why was the initial ratio set at 5-to-1? They argue because, 1 in a million people might whatever to whatever. The reality is it was to define the margins of cheating. You could cheat this much and not more. That was the purpose. It was unspoken, but it's the reality. Do you really believe that the organizers of anything care about the 1 in a million person? Or do you think they care about their bottom line?
Yeah. And do you think that, I mean, you kind of talked about like the point of a bureaucracy is to support itself. Do you think that this, thinking about performance enhancing drug use in sports, specifically Olympic sports, we're going to see much change from that kind of bottom line? Do you think it's generally, and I don't know what that would look like, but
I have a number of beliefs on that. The reality is, I believe that Olympic sports are gone. I think that they're already dead, and they just haven't quite woke up to that fact. I think you're going to see Olympic sports at large, the Olympics organization, the governance thereof, to just die. I think it's well in the process of that. I just think it's an ending thing. And because of that, organized doping is going to end for a number of reasons, including the fact that people just don't give a fuck. People don't care. People care about entertainment. People are very selfish. And I don't say that as a negative. I say that as a reality. People are selfish. They want to be entertained. The fact that drug-using athletes are more entertaining than none adds to the excitement of things. I don't think this fake wholesomeness has a future. I've thought that for a very long time, most of my life, dare I say. And I think we're seeing that crop up now. You see the IPF holding very suspicious events, and they're wildly popular. Coincidence? I doubt it.
Then do you think there would be, do you imagine there's a world in which there's kind of a break from the Olympics then to create something that's more commercially viable?
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely do. I think you're seeing it already. I mean, dude, as silly as it is, I think the X Games, it's a goofy example, but I think the X Games are an incredible example of that. That, the Olympics very quickly patterned some of their winter sports after that because it was fucking successful. Right. And it was successful in a commercial sense, not in it's so wholesome and everybody's so drug-free. It was, holy shit, this is interesting. People want to tune in and watch it. And that means dollars or euros or whatever the fuck you're operating in. And that's what powers this shit.
Yeah, and from the perspective of barbell, I say barbell sports, but like powerlifting and weightlifting, Max Ada and I were talking about weightlifting and how much more, I guess, like interesting it could be and like viewer friendly if it were more of like a team format. And they were able to get groups of athletes kind of like paired against another group of athlete and have some sort of like league or season, contrasted to where it's like, kind of from start to finish throughout the year, you have these major competitions you have to use to do that culminate in like bigger international events that qualify you for the Olympics. And then, everyone competes at the Olympics, and that's kind of like the big thing, right? So it's like, how do you make it commercially more viable or more interesting? And just as a viewer, more interesting as well. Do you have any perspective on how barbell, strength sports or powerlifting, weightlifting specifically could be more on that end of things rather than catering or pandering just towards the Olympics?
Well, I do actually, and it kind of offends everyone, but I do. I would say look at strongman. Look at professional strongman. Look at, for instance, the Giants Live series. It's wildly popular. They're filling 30,000 seat rooms in Europe. UK Strongest Man's drawing 30,000 people. An average event draws 5 every time. 5,000 people. A number, that's all the fucking Olympic lifters in America combined. If they all got in one room, they might not fill the fucking room. That's right. How many spectators they're drawing in Europe for strongman. So, yes, this is well understood. Commercialism, look at the WWE, look at Giants Live. It's a thing. You can do it. The problem is the old curmudgeon, unathletic fuckwits in power don't want to do that because it will basically vote them out of a fucking job. So until these old curmudgeon, unathletic, annoying bureaucrats die of dick cancer, no, this is what we're stuck with.
Yeah, you actually mentioned when I was talking to you, you said you were at a strongman event, which is kind of why we recorded this on Saturday. Are you also, do you just like watching strongman, or do you have some involvement there with respect to? I
try very hard not to, quote, incriminate anyone who I work with. So I will not name a name, but yes, I was there both in a personal and professional capacity.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, I think strongman is one of those things that kind of has rightfully so. It's as successful as it is, from a viewership standpoint, because it is interesting and tests a lot of different kind of like qualities with various implements and
it also gives the athletes the opportunity to be personally interesting.
Right.
Think about it. You know more about it, even if you're not a fan of strongman. You know more about Hafthor Bjornsson than you know about what asshole won a gold medal in the Olympics.
Right.
It is designed to focus on the athletes and not the bureaucrats. You don't know who runs the world's strongest man, but you know who he is.
No.
That's the difference. That is the fundamental difference is who is the sport designed for?
Mm.
Once you conquer that, then you can realize who's making the money, who's getting rich, who's stealing everything. That's the reality of it.
Yeah, and it sounds like specifically in weightlifting, we've been at the extreme, whereas strongman's been at one, the one you mentioned, like no one really knowing who's at the top or what they're doing. It's more athlete centered.
Absolutely.
And then on the other side, we have Olympic weightlifting, where it's like Thomas Ion is kind of like all over the place. His name's everywhere. He was kind of like heading it for decades and decades, and even after kind of realizing, I think more publicly realizing or recognizing kind of the corruption, and we've gotten that stuff like slow dripped out over time, where it's like, oh, this documentary came out, these news articles, this new information kind of incriminating all of them, right? And there's no change really.
No, absolutely not.
Change.
Again, not to be overly mean specifically to weightlifting, but the idea of them not being part of the Olympics, to me, I think is the beginning of their survival, not the continuation of their death.
Yeah. Could you maybe expand on that?
Well, I think that the reality is there are people, you probably fit into this category, but there are people that truly love, enjoy, have a deep endearment for weightlifting. Once those people don't have an avenue, they're going to make one, and it's going to be better. That's the reality. Powerlifting went through a really shit period in the 90s with West Side and the fucking biker infestation and the garbage. But the reality is it came out the other end wildly more healthy, wildly more interesting, wildly more viable, with a much broader, more popular purview. And I think that's unfortunately what Olympic lifting needs to go through. The IWF needs to be fucking killed like the zombie that it is, and something new and more interesting. I was, as shameful as this is, I was a little hopeful that CrossFit would actually spin that off. They kind of died of their own death separately, but my hope was when CrossFit was getting large that maybe they would spin off a interesting, entertaining weightlifting variant. I even posed that to some people in the mix. They seemed like they thought it was a good idea, but it never went anywhere. I mean, now obviously I'm not personally that influential, but nonetheless, I had that certain hope, but I think it's going to happen now. I think you're going to see what you mentioned, some sort of, American League or, North American League or something's going to crop up that's going to be very grassroots, very, base, and it will develop. And it should. And weightlifting's worth preserving, but not in the format it exists.
Yeah, and I think you're right in the sense of we recognize, we as in like the circle I kind of run with, like talking to people involved, it makes sense that we should get the athletes more front and center, kind of looking at what the UFC has done in the sense 100%. Of like having these like documentaries about the fighters, following them before in the lead up to fights, kind of putting them front and center and creating a storyline that people want to get behind and support.
And again, Rogue has done that to some degree with strongman and some of the weightlifting, but more focused on strongman, I think, right. Because people involved in strongman tend to be more persona based. I think the strongman in my mind is kind of the pro wrestling of strength sports.
Right.
But, I see little kernels of what I'm saying kind of out there. And I think once they, either emotionally or financially or whatever are driven to converge, I think you're going to see these little droplets form into a rather significant vessel of reality.
And I'm almost wondering, I know with powerlifting and there's an untested and tested, division, and then different federations are obviously like tested or untested. And then I'm not familiar with strongman, but I imagine most of it's likely untested. I'm not sure. But with weightlifting, do you think there's a world that exists in which there is that division created at some point where we see, we just have, the IWF now and everything's, quote unquote tested.
Well, everything's tested, but who's drug free? Come on.
Right.
I mean, that's my job. That's my job. Like, again, I can't throw people
Right.
under the bus, but that's my job. 25% of my fucking annual revenue is quote weightlifters. Let's be, and I'm one individual. So if you
Right.
assume there's 100 of me worldwide, and there's probably more, the reality is all weightlifters have their needs covered. So there's no such thing as drug tested. There's just a bureaucracy sucking away money. Again, look at and don't take my word for it. Please do this on your own time. Look at the dollar figures globally contributed to WADA. Look at the amount of money that agency wields. Now, whether you think that's good or bad, think about this. If that amount of money was distributed to the athletes, how much different would the fucking sport be? How many more people would have interest in the sport if suddenly there was billions of dollars potentially available to the athletes instead of some fat, angry, douchebag that is pissed off because they personally could never be an athlete, making decisions to govern the lives of athletes. Think about that. Seriously, clear your mind, and by all means, please do look up that number. You will be appalled at that number. The WADA and the IOC wield more money than the GDP of many nations.
Wow.
Nations!
Yeah, and I one of the reasons I bring this up is because I think there are a couple things you kind of hear kind of operating in the sport is, if they haven't had a positive test come back, then you can't assume. And then you would say like, well, they're able to compete and they're tested so many times, therefore they're likely clean and they're not taking any performance enhancing drugs. Do you think there's like a likelihood with international weightlifting where it's like, yeah, those things could be true and might hint at the fact that they aren't taking any performance enhancing drugs, but it's just so highly unlikely given kind of what you just said?
I don't know how to answer this without being far more aggressive than I intend to be, but obviously this answer is perspective based.
Right.
And I'm the drug guy. And typically when I communicate with somebody, it's usually about drugs. So there's very much a perspective based reality to this statement, but I'll make it nonetheless. I'm not aware of a drug free athlete. I don't know one. I don't know of one. I've never even heard tales of one. I don't believe it exists. I think it's like a fucking unicorn. Yeah. I know loads of people that bang their chest about how awesomely natural they are, and I don't believe them, and I have some very solid reasons to disbelieve them. So no, I don't think that's a real thing. And if you do find, and in the rare case that you do find a true natural athlete, they're so unimpressive that they're not part of the conversation anyway.
Right.
Let's also be real clear on this. Drugs work. Very basic, but very obvious statement. Anyone who's sick and taking a medication to get better knows drugs fucking work. So there's that.
Yeah.
And look at athletes that fail. They're not wildly ahead of everyone else. It's not, there's the field, and then there's this one guy that's 27% better than everyone else, and then he fails, and you're like, oh, that's why. No, it's always somebody who fails that's in the mix, meaning that they're an elite athlete with elite genetics and an entire organization and operation behind them, and they use drugs to achieve that level that everyone else achieved. Do you really believe that person is 27% inferior to fucking everyone else? Come on. That's asinine and very self-centered and self-centric.
Yeah, I think that's great to kind of clear that up because, I just being in this, you kind of hear that tossed around quite a bit. And I think there's this like hope that, our quote unquote heroes are doing it, correctly.
I find that comical. I find that a really comical mindset. I've said this regularly and kind of cheeky and kind of to make a point, but it's also true. If I was a billionaire and I owned a sports team and I found out someone on my team was not taking drugs, I'd fucking fire them on the spot. How dare you take my pay? How dare you accept pay to not be as good as you can be? How fucking dare you?
Yeah. That's a very interesting perspective, and I've kind of heard it mentioned Yeah. Anyways, we'll get off into the weeds. I feel like this has kind of gone on plenty long. I think it was a really interesting conversation, and one that kind of cornered me to be a bit more thoughtful about what I'm saying and how I'm saying it. So I think that's great. It's always a fun back and forth when you kind of have to be engaged at kind of a different level. Broderick, you did mention your members only site. You've mentioned the ebooks you've written. You've mentioned kind of the consulting work you do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure people listening, they're probably like, okay, I've never heard this guy talk before, and here he is, providing a perspective that really I don't think necessarily is available or as accessible in weightlifting. I kind of happened to find you through Dr. Mike and went down that kind of quote unquote rabbit hole. But for people who are kind of like newly introduced to you, where can they go to check out your work and to kind of get more engaged with it?
I got one very good bit of business. I'm a disaster of a business person. Not a question you asked, but just a point of fact. I'm a disaster of a business person. And I got shockingly little direction, but one I got that was very, very good, almost magical, is in regards to branding. So my business is Evil Genius Sports Performance, and the moniker we use across the board is Team Evil GSP. Literally that, Team Evil GSP. And anywhere we exist in any medium, that is how you can find us. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, our website domain, our email domains, anything you find us, it's Team Evil GSP. So if we're there, that's where we are. Or that's the tag that you would find us. And we exist in those things that I mentioned. And then we have a member site, which you can find if you just went to teamevilgsp.com. There's a link to it. And then specifically members.teamevilgsp will take you there.
Yeah, and for people, kind of like myself, I hear something like a conversation like this, and it kind of sparks something to just explore a bit of the avenues that were kind of like touched on during the conversation. The resources you've read or consumed, or the people you've talked to who have been hugely influential, and if I say this, it's going to be very broad, but in your ways of thinking about training or pharmacology, or like what you know about it, or how you've come to know what you know, what are some of those foundational resources you would recommend to people who also are finding an interest in this now?
Kind of comically and interestingly, I think most people that are at the level of being interested in this podcast, not the goofball that's just kind of, and I don't mean that as an insult, but I mean the very casual, just go to the gym, lift weights. Like I don't even consider that person, but somebody that's at the point of consuming content for the sake of up learning. My guess is that person actually already knows most of what they need to know. What they lack is the sort of organized perspective. If they could step back far enough and objectively look at, well, these were the totals in Olympic lifting in 1960 and 1970 and 1980, and they could really start to digest the direction of things and realize that there's never been any radical ups or downs in terms of numbers posted, and no real radical ups and downs in terms of body weights and those sorts of things, they'd start to realize that this has been there the whole time. This is part of it. This isn't some new conversation. This is just newly allowed to be spoken out loud. And I think that what most people lack is that, just an honesty of context. I really don't think it's, if you just read, the book Speed Trap, you would be completely up to speed and know everything. Right. Sure, it's a great book and you should read it, but there is no singular elucidating reality. The reality is you need to open your eyes and see fucking reality.
Yeah. I think that's actually a great point, and one that I found, if I go in with the perspective like I need to, like, this is like the thing, it tends to be underwhelming. Yes. Because it's kind of this like conglomeration of the body of work, along with, as you mentioned, the perspective, to kind of view it as freshly as possible. So I think that's a great point. Yeah, if people are listening to this and they, it's something that is kind of new to them, please go check out teamevilgsp.com. I would say even give the members only site, a trial, check it out. I'm definitely going to do the same. So you'll probably catch me on there perusing through it. And then, if you guys are interested in following me and keeping up with what I'm doing, you can go to Instagram, and my handle is Josh_PhilWL. That's PHILWL. Philosophical weightlifting everywhere else. And we will catch you guys next week on another episode of the podcast.